Fiona Patten, welcome into the weeds. It's an absolute privilege and honour to have you here. Thank you for coming up.
It's great to be here. We are in the jungle.
Welcome to the jungle.
Yeah,
We've
you.
got fun and games. Absolutely amazing. You are one of the most fearless, ferocious politicians Australia has ever seen. You've been a politician. You've been a sex worker, you've been a pornographer, you've been an advocate, you've been so many things. Yeah. You are having one of the most incredible lives I've ever read about. I read your amazing biography, Sex, Drugs and the Electoral Roll, which is, I just read it and it reads like Hunter S. Thompson. It really does.
Jerry,
It does. It really is. It's like this gonzo life. It's absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
But you came from quite conservative background. You born in Canberra into a Navy military family, English Scottish background. Tell us how it is that you are who you are now with such a middle class background.
You know when you're a kid and you just always think you were adopted? That family can't possibly be yours. I don't know. Maybe you didn't have that feeling, but
sometimes I wish I was.
I know.
Yeah.
I was really, this can't be my family. But no, I think they were strong people. One of the points or one of the life experiences was moving all the time, and I think that does build up a kind of a resilience in you, and that you've got to make friends. You've got to kind of fit into your new environment. You've got to, just kind of suck it up and enjoy it if you can. So I think that kind of helped us and enabled us to kind of go on maybe paths less followed. And
you weren't just you weren't just moving, from one suburb in Canberra or to Melbourne. You were travelling around the world. Your family was moving to the UK, the US, all over the place.
Yeah, that's right. So we moved every 2 years, and every 1 or 2 years, we went to a new school. So, you can imagine, just even when you had a different accent as well, there's a novelty there for a little while, but then you're just a little bit different. But yeah, I think that kind of helped us, become. I don't like the word resilient, but just you just got on with things. And my mother was a real one for just getting on with it, and not complaining and not
stiff upper lip. And
stiff upper lip, yeah.
But yeah. You do have some revolutionaries in the family tree. You had a suffragette, quite a famous suffragette, as one of your great aunts, didn't you?
It was amazing reading my great aunts. And I think, when everyone's an aunt because they're not your cousin or your parents. So I'm not sure what sort of aunt she would have been to the family. But, yeah, she was Jessie Street, so from my mother's side of the family. Yeah, suffragette. One of the first women to try and run for Parliament in New South Wales. She ran a couple of times, came close, got beaten by blokes a lot of the time. She got involved in sex work, in saving sex workers. So we would have been on different sides of politics on some of the issues. But yeah, she also sort of changed the way we looked at sexual health during, I think it was Vietnam or Korea, maybe Korean War, when we had a lot of R&R and Americans up in King's Cross. Yeah, so she was, there's a statue of her in Sydney and a library, I think.
Amazing. And so it makes you wonder if it's in the genes to be outspoken, to be, have a social conscience, and to be an activist, actually to tip over into doing things. When did, because let's talk a little bit about your youth, because it's a fantastic story. Everyone's got to read Fiona's biography. But it was a bit of a misspent youth. It was typical of the time that, late 70s, 80s, dabbling here in a bit of landscape art, landscape architecture, hanging out on the beach, boys, bongs, panel vans, all that, classic Australiana.
Yes, completely all of that, and I lived in America, and so cannabis, I think it was Caribbean Gold, became available when I started high school over there in a sophomore year.
What state were you in?
I was in Maryland.
Yeah, right.
So it was Caribbean Gold that used to be brought in, I think I don't know where it came from, but that used to come in, and so I first tried cannabis over there, which was a great experience, really, and then got myself further into trouble, and then we came back to Australia, and I continued to get into trouble.
Because, well, you're fearless. Like you're not afraid to try things. You know what you like, and you make a decision based on what's good for you, and those formative years really helped you develop, like who you are, what you like, and you became an advocate for it.
Well, that's right, and I think in those days when I think everybody wanted to be an astronaut, but if you couldn't be an astronaut, you wanted to be an architect, and then I went from architecture to industrial design, possibly following a boy, but then possibly. He didn't have a panel van, but he had a 120Y hatchback.
Oh, nice. Daddo.
You can sleep in those. And then I ended up in fashion design, and like you said, down the coast.
Well, you had a fashion label, and it's funny that you called it body politic.
I know that.
How weird is that? It's like it was a premonition of everything that was going to come. But you were a fashion designer in Canberra, living a bit of a Bohemian life. It sounds very idyllic. You had a beautiful apartment, all set up, hanging out with the sort of who's who in Canberra in the boutique. If there was a who's who
in Canberra. But yeah, I mean, who I was hanging out with was the sex workers and the gays.
Yeah.
They were the people who could afford to buy Sydney, Oxford Street fashion in Canberra, to buy local designers. So there was, I think if I had actually sold champagne at my office, at the shop, I would have made more money than selling clothes. But because it was a fun spot to stop.
It was a scene.
Brought their drinks and smokes and everything there. You could still smoke inside in those days.
Wow.
I know.
I remember that. I remember going to pubs where everyone had a beer and a cigarette in their hand. You had to hold your cigarette up in the air, or you'd come home with burns on your face where people had turned around and got you in the eye with the cigarette. I think people just don't understand how bad it must have been.
There was, most of your clothes had cigarette holes in them.
I know.
And my one try at doing something right was I went and worked for the Commonwealth Bank. It didn't last. We had to leave. It was a mutual agreement that I should leave within my 3 months probation. But my mum came in one day, and of course you could smoke in the bank.
Yep.
So I was, in the back doing some, stupid thing, smoking, and my mum came in and was like, so anyway, I got caught smoking at the bank.
But what you were doing, you were hanging out with a scene, and as you say, part of that scene was sex workers, the gay community, and you took a job with Wise. And that was a pivotal moment, wasn't it? So tell us about that.
That was a real game changer. And I think, look, I'd been volunteering around Wise and the AIDS Council. I'd been helping out on needle and syringe exchange buses and stuff like that. We used to run fashion parades to raise money for workers in sex employment. We do these sort of 3 a.m. fashion shows, champagne breakfasts at my auntie's restaurant in Fishwick after all the brothels had shut. So everyone used to come, and we'd just sort of chat and smoke and drink till dawn and try on clothes and, and occasionally sell a bit of clothing, but we'd have a good time. And then I took a job with workers in sex employment.
And this was in the mid-'80s?
This would have been probably early 90s by then.
Yep.
So we were already starting to see... we were starting to see some of that really sensible policy that came out during HIV and AIDS in Australia, when Australia was a leader in harm reduction, when Australia understood harm reduction. So there was this notion that if you wanted to see safe sex in the sex industry, then you probably need to legalise it and regulate it and not criminalise people for sex work, which made them, which probably, could lead to unsafe practices, because you didn't want to have condoms because they would have been evidence.
And you were, I think that was, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but there were a couple of politicians that, like Health Minister Blewett and Baum, that really leant into it. They weren't clutching their pearls. They were good MPs. They looked at the evidence and then how do we reduce harm?
Right.
And they acted in a way that really did save lives. And I think that had an impact on you, didn't it?
Like, this was absolutely. You're really right, Jeremy. I mean, this was an epidemic, and
HIV,
AIDS. We, Australia did not feel immune to it, and it was a bipartisan approach, which was just, since then it's rare. But there you had both the Shadow Health Minister and the Health Minister in lockstep on providing the funding to understand that peer education was one of the best ways of distributing information to ensure people were safe, that discrimination legislation needed to protect people who were at risk of being discriminated against and then at risk of possibly contracting HIV because they weren't practicing safe sex or they were sharing needles or other risky behaviour. And so in that, they started providing funding for AIDS councils, for drug user associations and for sex worker associations. And to this day, they still do. And we're one of the only countries in the world that does that.
And it had a massive impact because it rapidly reduced the spread of HIV, created, got rid of the fear, got rid of the stigma, and saved lives. But you were right at the tip of the spear of it happening in Canberra, working for WISE at that time. You'd taken a role with them.
And
so
the national group Scarlet Alliance. So I was doing some of the
Alliance
national lobbying. But it was, and
that was the peak body for the sex industry.
That's right. So it was the peak body for sex workers.
Sex workers.
And you're absolutely right. We had in the ACT, we saw a change. We saw a sort of a largely crossbench kind of government. The government of the day didn't ever hold balance of power. So you had lots of independents.
And this is not the Legislative Assembly
in the ACT. Yeah, thanks. So it's not, it wasn't federal parliament in those days. But yes, a politician called Michael Moore did a study on HIV, criminal activity and sex work. And the recommendations were, if you want a safe sex industry, and again, it was sort of a nasty time that we were sex workers were seen as possible vectors of disease to the community, and I mean that goes back to colonial times and prior to that. But as a result of that, we saw decriminalisation of sex work in the ACT, and I got to be at the front of that, and it was a new ACT had only recently got self-government, so they were all baby politicians and we were baby lobbyists, and we really learned a lot around how to advocate for change, particularly in a cross-party, a very diverse parliament as the ACT was at the time.
So it was very formative because you learnt like not only about issues but how change happens.
That's right.
And so it was really powerful. But you did a lot of advocacy. One of the remarkable stories that is in your book and in your life is open days at brothels. So come and check it out. Like for those who haven't been, if you want to see what's happening. So as part of that decriminalisation, there's that demystifying, reducing stigma. So the open day at the brothel, and you had some surprising attendees. We just had no idea it would be so successful. So, we even did like sausage sizzles out the front of a couple of the brothels. And, whose sausage was sizzling?
That's right. Putting a bun on like a condom. And but then, so we did the first open day, and I think we had like 300 or 400 people actually went round and visited brothels on a Saturday morning, just before they did their fruit and veg shop. They went for a visit round all the brothels. So we started this idea of Oral Sex Day, which would a safe oral sex day, actually. So this would be a day that we would invite people again into brothels. And I had got the Chief Minister, Kate Carnell. She opened the Safe Oral Sex Day at the, wasn't Touch of Class. I can't remember the name of which. It was a brothel in Mitchell anyway, maybe Centrefolds. Anyway, she opened that. We had an Anglican minister came to speak about...
Any demos? Were there like...
No, I think...
No, not demonstration. Like not
demos.
not protest.
Oh my gosh,
like,
yes.
Like demonstration.
Yeah. Well, of course. I mean, it was Safe Oral Sex Day. I mean, you do have to learn to put a condom on with your mouth, or how to use a dental dam. And we had a very famous porn star out one year, Nina Hartley, and she was the judge of the Safe Oral Sex Day. So she sat back in a chair and a queue of people went down on her using a dental dam, and then she judged it.
Scored it.
Yeah.
Well,
and much to a lot of the women's surprise, a man won.
Really?
Yeah. So that was a surprise because there was actually probably more females in the competition than men. But this young fellow, he just, whatever he did it for Nina. And, he won the prize. We had Safe Oral Sex Olympics where you would be judged on how quickly you could put a condom on with your mouth, how quickly you could lick body sauce off something. No, in a licensed venue, I'm really not quite sure how we got away with that.
But it was spectacularly popular.
Really popular.
There was queues around. I'm not surprised.
Oh, it was amazing. It led to the Love Bus, which was then a weekly tour.
There you go.
I was sometimes doing 2 tours a week of brothels, tabletop dancing venues, adult shops, and in those days we were still duplicating videos or duplicating DVDs.
Yeah, I mean, because this is the 1990s. This is pre-internet. This is when, for people playing at home, this is when everything was in magazines or on a VHS. And it was a very different time. There was a lot of moral panic about pornography. Sex work was still illegal. People had to send away for pornography, for either in tapes or magazines and these types of things. But we'll get onto that because you end up leading that industry. But you also end up jumping the counter. You're working as an for Wise, but you then decide that why not give this a bit of a whirl? And
I was there to help. Now, in whatever way I could, whether it was needle and syringe exchanges, condoms, lube, or just helping out when they were a sex worker short. So, yes, there'd been a client waiting for quite a long time. Everyone was busy. I had nothing to do because everyone was busy, so I was just sitting around. So it just seemed like the most sensible thing for me was to help the place out and help this guy out who turned out to be a really nice guy, and turns out that I knew how to do it.
Just came naturally.
I don't know.
There you go.
I had some practice, but rarely had I been paid for it. So yeah, that was a real added bonus. And I didn't take it on as a career, but it certainly got me a few holidays. That's for sure.
You spent a bit of time up in Cairns, did a bit of sex work there, but you found it like overly productive and positive experience. You met some nice people, had some great sex, probably some ordinary sex too. But,
yes.
But it wasn't this terrifying experience.
Not at all. And pretty much a lot of sex workers will tell you that it's not the job that's hard. It's telling people about the job that's hard. So lots of sex workers live double lives as a result of that. And that's what's really complicated, like trying to, lie about where you are, lie about how you can afford good shoes for the kids and holidays, and that's what really makes sex work difficult for people.
Yeah, well, it's refreshing now that we do refer it to as sex work.
Yes.
It's not just prostitution and whores and all the rest of it. One of the, I think, really frightening stories from your book is the story about being in Queensland and this moral panic where they were moving to decriminalise sex work. But Wayne Goss said, the only place you can do it is not in a brothel. You've got to do it in your house on your own. Yeah. Like, what a stupid fucking policy that was.
I know.
And it led to death, didn't it?
It was really dangerous, and it did lead to sex workers getting targeted and killed. We had a few murders on the Gold Coast at that time.
Because they couldn't even have like someone in another room. You had to be on your own. Otherwise, you were considered to be running a brothel and go to jail.
You couldn't employ anyone to even answer your phones or drive you. Yeah, it was so ridiculous. I mean, it also meant that probably the people supplying the electricity to your home would have been seen as supporting you, and that could have been illegal. So the legislation did eventually change. I mean, but Wayne Goss had a lot to answer for there. He also, he carried on kind of the Joe Bielke-Peterson era of ridiculous censorship up there that, strangely enough, even with the world of the internet, the censorship in Queensland is still incredibly draconian.
And it's about this time that it's probably a bit before this, that you meet your lifelong partner, Robbie. And I've got to say, if there's ever been in Australian politics a more provocative prankster couple, it's you guys. I mean, the merry pranksters of politics, cross-dressing, raiding, conservative Christian forums, doing everything you possibly can to annoy all the right people. I mean, Robbie's been amazing, hasn't he, in your life? You're still with him, and he's just an absolute raconteur.
I know, he is extraordinary and has done...
Robbie Swan.
Robbie Swan has done amazing things in his life. But yes, we met in around 91, 92. And it was weird because we knew of each other, and Canberra's a small place. In fact, I was good friends with his best friend, but I'd never met him, except we used to out angry letters to the editor. I was angry letters to the editor about sex work. He was angry letters to the editor about X-rated films. Would quite often appear next to each other in the letters to the editor page. So we used to, or we'd be quoted in similar. And
you didn't know
articles.
Each other.
We'd never met. I was sharing a house with a guy called Andy Swan. Gavin, one of his best mates, used to regularly stay at my house. But I'd never met Robbie, and then we finally did meet.
Was it love at first sight?
No. Sorry, Robbie. No, it was. We were obviously really interested in each other, but I wasn't. Like, I had a boyfriend. I was moving to Queensland. I was moving up to Cairns. I had a whole stuff set. I was really busy. I think I'd just been evicted from my house, so I had a lot going on, and really, this bloke was just going to make my life more complicated, which he did. He did very successfully. He was very persuasive, and he's like, "Come on, just run for the Parliament. You won't have to do anything." Anyway, so it wasn't. It was. It started. It was a great start to the relationship. He sent me love letters as Caroline Sweetley.
Caroline Cummings Sweetley.
Caroline Cummings Sweetley. That's right.
What a great
and
name.
at that stage, I still didn't know that Caroline Cummings Sweetley was him.
No,
I didn't, because I knew about this. I hadn't paid much attention to it, but I'd seen, this woman, and he would write. So he wrote these letters, and I had no idea. And then he showed me this video of Caroline Sweetley, and I was still a bit uncertain
because he was made up very well,
really well.
He was quite hot. I've got to say.
Well, you know the story. Like, this journalist did fall in love with him or in lust with him.
I know.
And that was really awkward.
And then had to out him. And like it was
outed him.
on telly.
I know, that was well, it was a hilarious time, but and weirdly, the costume that he was wearing, part of it had come from my shop.
Really?
Yeah. So
Wow,
the
all
woman
these
who'd done the dressing.
convergences.
I know. It was
the
obviously
stars
made to be.
aligned.
It was meant to be.
So you're back in Canberra. Robbie's working on X-rated videos. You're working on the sex work things.
Yeah.
You get together. Is that when you started Eros?
Just after that, yeah. So we met. Robbie was looking to run an election campaign.
Yep.
Not to get elected, but just because the Liberal Party at the time had said if we can't ban X-rated films, we will tax them out of existence.
Yep.
So we wanted to run a campaign to, kind of challenge those notions, also challenge the positions on sex work and talk about a range of sex and censorship issues. So we joined up with the disgraced Transport Minister, Craig Dewby, who had set up the No Self-Government Party and then had successfully run into 2 elections as the No Self-Government. At no time had tried to abolish self-government. In fact, became the Minister for Transport until he got done for DUI 3 times.
So he was Minister for Transport, DUI, abolished self-government, stays in government. Is this the fella that was living in the Parliament?
No, that was the anti-pornography. No.
Oh, right, that was another one.
Look, Craig was probably living in a car. I'm not sure. But you were building alliances. Yeah. It's something you've always been very, very good at. You were building alliances with people who were... That's right. So we joined Craig. We joined... he brought on board a Cambodian monk.
Of course.
So, of course. Setaku, I think his name was, or Setawi, I can't remember. So we got coined the drunk, the monk, and the spunk. And I wasn't the drunk. I had to make that very clear to my parents as well. But
you weren't the monk either.
I was not the monk either. No one was accusing me of being the monk. No one was accusing me of that. But a band set up in Melbourne called the Drunk, the Monk, and the Spunk.
Really?
And I think they actually still operate. I think they still play. Anyway, I actually got the 4th highest personal vote in that one, but
you didn't get elected.
No. And fortunately, because we had no intention, but that was when we formed. That led to the forming of the Eros Association.
And so that forms really because, it's sort of disappearing into the mists of time. Yeah. But back in the day, we had 2, there was a massive issue, which was censorship. We had a lot of people out there, the tambourine thumpers, Fred Nile, some very senior politicians who wanted to abolish the X rating, which is pornography, non-violent erotica. Yeah. Just completely ban it. And this is at a time when, I remember growing up in the 80s, there was the R18 rating, like for things like Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Friday the 13th Part 3, where you could see people just being, getting their genitals hacked off with a machete, but you couldn't see someone, fucking.
That's right. When we used to say, you can show someone slicing a nipple off, but you can't show someone sucking one.
And that was the fact. That was the fact.
That was actual law that you could, show a person being dismembered, but you couldn't show someone being pleasured.
And this is at a time when X-rated videos are becoming much more popular, magazines, and there was a big mail order industry operating out of Canberra. It was like part of the GDP of the ACT, wasn't it? Fishwick was famous, wasn't it? It was like one of the biggest... It's what made the Australia Post the busiest out of Canberra. Look, I may or may not have, sent the form away for a couple back in the day. But I wasn't Robinson Crusoe. It was across the country, wasn't it? Big industry. They were trying to wipe it out.
Largest mailing list in Australia. I think second only to American Express. So we had a larger mailing list than Reader's Digest at the time.
Was it millions?
It was millions. It was
Millions of people.
You know, millions of people who were regularly buying X-rated films. There was a lot, it was when women were starting to get interested as well. There was a lot of material being directed towards couples and towards women, and there was and there was also a lot of amateur coming out, because that was sort of when people started to get their own home VHSs and could start making their own porn at home. In fact,
the gay community as well.
Oh, the gay community, exactly,
of course.
Exactly. In fact,
fetishes, all the rest of it. The I used to get, I mean, that was the only place I could get them.
That's right. They were classified, and there was no...
Consensual, non-violent, heaps
right.
of fun.
Heaps of fun.
But a massive industry. There was a real moral panic. Howard was coming in, and there was a real panic about it, and a real move to clamp down. How did you win?
Look, we didn't win. We haven't won. Today, it is still illegal to sell an X-rated film in any state in Australia. It is an offence. So, it was only probably 15 years ago that a guy went to prison for selling an X-rated video, like how archaic and antique anyway, retro, selling an X-rated film from an adult store in Oxford Street.
2010.
To an adult.
Crazy.
Yeah.
But that's at a time when you can get online and look at Pornhub and see who knows what, everything under the sun.
Exactly.
Bizarre.
So back in the 90s, we had Senator Brian Harradine in the federal Senate, who did hold a balance of power position.
And he was a super conservative, right-wing moral crusader from Tasmania. Eyes very close together.
Who watched a lot of porn.
Right. Research,
yeah. But, our friend.
Fred Nile too. Oh, my God.
Well, there was when the internet first came in at New South Wales Legislative, in the Parliament, it got completely hit by all sorts of bugs and things like that. So they did this massive audit. Guess who was watching the most porn?
I know, Freddie.
Freddie.
He was always tabling in Parliament. These Penthouse and Hustler and Razzle and all the rest.
Look at these.
Look at all these terrible magazines. And because he tabled them, they have to be stored in perpetuity in the state archives. So there's a great big pile of all this classic porn that Fred has put into the archives. And if you go down to level 5 and along the corridor in the third door, it's all still there. Apparently.
I know.
But Fred's responsible for actually archiving the biggest repository of 1980s and 90s porn you can imagine. Good on you, Fred.
He would have some great classics. There would be some great classics. But he also had his own personal collection as well, which apparently, young reporters at the Sydney Morning Herald, like they would get the religion beat. And the first thing he would take new reporters to was to this giant room where there was literally hundreds and hundreds of filthy films.
Really?
And he would show them to them. Yeah.
It's a funny thing, is it? Because a really interesting part of your book is Robbie's view about why we like to watch people fuck. And it's a fascinating thing. And it's like... there's two things humans love. It's to watch violence and to watch fucking. I mean, essentially all of our movies are simulated sex and simulated violence. We like to watch violence because we go, well, I don't want that to happen to me.
Yeah.
And I've got to avoid that, and I'm glad that's not happening, this sort of voyeur thing. But with sex, a different thing, it's like... am I doing it right?
Am I doing it right?
Just to be reassured that, is this, am I covering all the bases?
I mean, it's one of the, we complain about young people watching explicit material, but we provide them with no other form of education on whether they're doing it right and whether they will be able to do something pleasurable. So it's, of course people are going to go and look to explicit material. But, we had huge mailing lists. I think in Brisbane, 10% of the electorate was on a mailing list in Canberra. And Canberra was known. I mean, we were porn pyrotechnics and politicians.
Yeah.
And I think the porn industry was, and I don't know that we were the largest export, but we were either the largest or second to the pine plantations.
There you go.
More wood.
Canberra wood.
Canberra wood.
Responsible for wood supply. There you go. But you form the foundation, Eros, and it does other stuff as well. So it's fighting this campaign and like fighting it in a coherent way.
Yeah.
It's fighting making recommendations to Senate inquiries, lobbying people, writing letters, and being effective. And at least, even though it hasn't been legalised, it sort of wound back the enforcement, didn't it?
Yeah, I think, and that was in some ways, if we could stop the police raiding our members, then that was a win. We worked towards trying to change legislation many times. But we also, there was the threat of it becoming a banned import again. So certainly John Howard in his run for federal for the 1996 election, he made a commitment that if he was elected, he would ban X-rated films.
And why did he wind that back?
Well, we didn't threaten, it's in the book now, we didn't threaten them publicly, but we did say, hey, if you are about to ruin the livelihoods of all of our members, so we will write to every single person on this mailing list. These were early days of data processing that we were able to collate everyone's list into electorates. So we knew exactly how many people were in every electorate on our list and how many people we could target. And in most of them, we could target 3 to 4% of the electorate. And we said, look, it will cost us a lot of money, but we don't care. We're going to do it because you are going to wipe us out of existence. And so the then federal director of the Liberal Party came and saw us, Andrew Robb, and said, how can we avoid this happening? We said, well, you could not ban X-rated films. And he said, all right, how might we do that? And we said, well, you could introduce a new classification called non-violent erotica, and then you actually could ban X-rated films, but you would have non-violent erotica. And he said, all right, it's a deal. So but you can't tell anyone. So we did that, and they were true to their word.
But you hit it up. You really did muscle up. That's a pretty serious electoral threat. At one point, you nearly went to jail, didn't you, for contempt of the Senate? Like, because you said, hey, we know some things about you.
Yeah, that's right.
And you were like nearly got done for contempt of Parliament.
Yeah, we were done with threatening senators, and it's weirdly, it's the second time I've been found in contempt of Parliament. Oh, sorry, that was the first time I have been found in contempt of Parliament another time. Of course. But that time it was serious. And, we went to give evidence and they said, listen, just before you start giving your evidence, we just want you to know that we've reported you for contempt of Parliament because of your submission where you have threatened to out senators. We're like, right. Do we keep talking or, should we leave now? Anyway, they did the report, found that we possibly were in contempt of Parliament, but it was not worthy of a prison sentence.
Yeah, but it's a pretty serious thing.
Oh, you can go to prison for it.
Yeah.
And it was it was a real tactic also to kind of force us to back off in that. But we learned a lesson then. And Robbie had got up on the wrong side of the bed around that time as well and had taken an early morning radio show call where he had then said, I've got security footage of a senior coalition minister going into an adult store with his wife. And anyway, that caused quite a ruckus. It also caused a lot of politicians to come forward and say that it was them. Russell Broadbent looking at you. And then we had to tell him it wasn't.
It wasn't preemptively outed.
No.
Classic. Hands up who it wasn't. That's hilarious. The other thing you're doing at that time is advocating for sex workers. Yeah. So that was like hard to organise a union around sex workers. And so there's people working in the porn industry, but there's also sex workers. What was the work you were doing there? Because this was a stage where even despite education and government programs, these were people at risk. It was still criminalised in a lot of places. So what was the work you did there with the Eros Foundation?
Yeah, it was really interesting, and I think and I don't know whether it would work today, but in setting up the foundation, while we said, look, we've all got different, different goals, different places that we sit in this industry, we all have exactly the same opponents. So, it's not, for example, like someone who's in a adult film, quite often you'll speak to them about sex work and they'll go, oh, I would never do that. You go, right. And then you'd speak to sex workers about maybe being in adult films and they go, oh, no way. Oh, God, that wouldn't be exposed. Everyone could see you. And when you speak to people in adult films about being about being a sex worker, they go, but you'd have to have sex with someone you didn't know.
Yeah, because a lot of people who are in films, they're in a partnership.
Or they know they're really familiar with the other performers.
They do it regularly with them.
So it was really interesting. So we were fighting for sex worker reform around the country, but we were also doing it with the businesses, which that got me offside with some of the more militant sex worker groups at the time. So I got into a bit of trouble around then. But, we did, in the end, we've seen the decriminalisation of sex work pretty much spread around the country. We're still waiting for South Australia and Tasmania, but every other state has moved, has reformed. It hasn't been perfect by any means, and it's interesting when you and I talk about decriminalisation of cannabis versus decriminalisation of sex work, and they're two very different things. And I think sometimes those languages, become difficult to understand what we're talking about. But yeah, it was interesting times. But things like we ran the Love Bus, so I would have up to 50 women every night, every Friday and Saturday night. Coming on the bus, drinking champagne, visiting brothels, speaking to sex workers, going to tabletop dancing venues, speaking to the dancers, going to, adult stores and a whole range of places and getting...
Buying up.
Oh, yeah. No, I would set...
Coming up with armfuls of gear.
I would set them, I'd set them little tasks to go in there, like first person to bring me a dildo more than 12 inches long wins a prize. Taught them about what a dildo is and what a vibrator is. There'd be some films shot in Australia, so the first one to find an Australian porno would win a prize, or the first person to find the weirdest thing, which would be, a periscope that was also a speculum.
Really? Just having a bit of a look.
Yes, that's right. I think it even had a light. I can't remember. Or the talking vibrator.
Oh,
I know. But weirdly, it had a female voice.
Ooh.
Anyway, there was, But it was a really great way of educating people around sex work and around the sex industry.
Normalising it. It's part of our lives.
That's right. And demystifying it. I remember taking...
And you can have fun.
Yeah.
Having sex. Who knew?
Who knew?
Hey?
My mother-in-law did. Her and my father-in-law used to come over to our house all the time to swap out. We were like their video library.
Really?
Yeah, they didn't bother with the mail order. They would just come to our place and swap out, and we had to keep up with the new stuff just to keep my parents-in-law happy with the range of videos that they were getting from us each week. But I took my mother-in-law on the Love Bus, and I realised at one stage I was actually talking about cunnilingus, and then I was about to put a condom on with my mouth onto a vibrator, and there was my mother-in-law in front of me watching.
We've all done that.
She didn't have a go, but I wonder when she got home.
Well.
Anyway, but in the brothel, she was like, wow, you look at this. She said, I used to say to the boys, your bedroom looks like a brothel on payday. She said, I'll have to stop saying that, won't I? They're lovely. Lovely,
and
clean
tidy.
places.
That's hilarious and really important work you're doing. You ran the Sexpo. That was a big thing. Is Sexpo still going?
Yes and no. I mean,
It's on and off again.
Yeah, I think it's kind of
Big industry show with, the who's who. You have some big famous porn stars. You met Ron Jeremy. Oh, my God.
Oh, my God. Oh, my God.
He was a regular in some of the pornography I saw when I was young. I was just like, oh, my God, this guy, he's hardly, ripped. He was just
Hardly.
He was this big, fat toad guy with a dick like your leg. That was it.
That was it. But I think it was because he was so ugly that it made men think,
reverse psychology.
If he can, I can.
Yes.
But when we first started Sexpo, again, it was about demystifying the industry, and we just wanted people to see what we were talking about, what nonviolent erotica was, what was behind those, 18-plus doors. And in the first one, we just had everything on display. We never thought to sell it. And people went in incredibly disappointed.
Really?
What do you mean I can't buy it? And then I think on the second day, we were everyone's rushing to try and get product in
Merch.
there. Yeah, and the conference next to us was the annual Chartered Accountants Convention.
And they were just streaming in.
They were. But the papers tried to cause some friction there, and how does it feel having the pornographers next to you? And they're like, bet theirs is going to be more interesting than ours. But we did invite them all.
Can you write off a dildo on your tax? I don't think you can.
Can if you're a sex worker.
Yeah,
you can.
Fringe benefit.
And your watch. If you're a sex worker, because time is very important. That's right.
And 3, 2, 1.
There we go.
There we go.
Time for a shower. Yeah. But then Sexpo has become hugely popular, and it was a real rite of passage for lots of people. And it was one of the first consumer shows in the world. Most of the other shows had been B2B, business-to-business shows, and we were one of the first consumer shows here. And Australians loved it. Yeah. Funny, not so much. Sydney was always a hard one to do, except for the year that the World Youth Catholic, what was that thing?
Yeah, what was it called? The Pope was coming.
The Pope came, and it was Youth Catholic Year or something, and
Sexpo all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Was doing amazing
busiest ever, and we actually put a confessional in that one.
Really?
Because and we had a porn star dressed as a nun.
As a nun.
Yeah, we did get protesters at that one.
That's good.
Yeah.
But there were some big campaigns there. Hypocrite was a really, in terms of the Catholic Church, that was and we'll talk about this a bit later in terms of your parliamentary work, but that's where you really started to shine the light on the hypocrisy of some of these moral crusaders. They were the devils that they were chasing.
That's right.
The pedophilia, the institutional abuse in the Catholic and other churches and organisations. You really started to say, hey, whose house isn't in order here? That was a pretty amazing moment in Australian history, really.
We produced Hypocrites, which was, we just did the research to look at, when you looked at all of the convicted child sexual assault cases that were not familial.
Yep.
When you looked at all of the convicted cases, and we went back, I think we tried to go back 10 to 15 years, which this was late 90s, so it was, it was still early days for kind of online research, so we did a lot of offline research. 99% of those people had worked in religious organisations. So we published Hypocrites, and it was just really, it was a list, and we had 3 recommendations, I think it was. The first one was there needed to be a royal commission into institutional sexual abuse, and we delivered that. We posted that to every church in Australia, to every local councillor, to every state politician, and to every federal politician. We got death threats, but we also got people writing to us saying, could you please send it to these people? So we got asked to send it to Boston. We got asked to send it to a whole bunch of areas that were starting to work on this. And we were accused, like somehow George Pell tried to argue that this was a sales gimmick for us, that somehow by publishing hypocrites about all of these people who had been so anti our industry yet had been, doing heinous crimes against children.
Convicted pedophiles.
That somehow putting out this list was a way to promote sales in adult stores. So it was absolutely preposterous and
vile from a
absolutely
vile character.
And Chrissy Foster, she and her husband fought long and hard to get to expose Pell for the arsehole that he was. She rang us that night and told her story about Pell, and even just that one phone call, we felt vindicated by what we had done. But it really did. It was the first time that someone had said this, and these were the same groups that were saying, protect the children, ban pornography.
Yeah, that's right.
And the same ones, Keith Wright, head of the Queensland Labor Party.
Yep.
Ban pornography, porn-free zones.
ACL and all the rest.
Yeah.
The Australian Christian lobby and these.
I credit Fred Nile for the establishment of the Eros Association. Like, he really did help get us organised.
Yep.
And I think the Christian lobby credit the Eros Association for getting them organised.
Yep.
So I don't know who's going to come next.
But at this time as well, there's a big push to the internet emerges. And I remember the first thing I ever saw, the video I ever saw on the internet involved and a beautiful young woman. And I went, this is going to be a hit. I don't know what this is, but oh my God. And this is dial-up in country New South Wales.
Yeah.
And I had a friend going, mate, come over, my neighbour, going, come and have a look at this. It's the internet. And I was going, like, it took 45 minutes for a 15-second video. And I was going, that's going to be a hit.
Yeah.
And it's been pretty popular, the old internet and
popular.
pornography on the internet. But straight away, we had some the pearl clutchers saying censorship. Let's censor the internet, and it wasn't just on the right. There was people on the left, like Clive Hamilton and the Australia Institute. They were like going, "Oh, no, we can't have this."
Yeah.
There was some real nanny status.
That's right.
On the left, and the moral crusaders on the right as well. So tell us about that, because if you're at home enjoying Pornhub just after this video, you've got Fiona Patten to thank.
Their understanding of the internet was not surprisingly very low. And I don't know, I would love to know who the card was in Senator Colbert's office. I think it was Senator Colbert, because he was in a Senate committee hearing and he said, no, you just press P on your computer and the porn comes down. Like, really? How did they do that? God, your staff are good. But there was this notion that it was everywhere and that it was like, that it wasn't taking 35 minutes for a 10-second thumbnail clip. So there was this notion that we could set up an internet filter around Australia. And you're right, we had Clive Hamilton, we had a lot of feminist organisations were also on this censorship bandwagon, and they had been, Senator Harradine and the sort of the far right and that sort of radical left.
I remember Kathleen Maltson from the Green.
Yeah,
she was very, very strong on it.
Very strong, and also very anti-sex work, and she's been seems to be poking around that field again at the moment. Troubling. But yes, so we had these people from the left and the right attacking it as the internet came out. But you look at what we can do on the internet now, like even some of the HTML. I mean, that HTML design, a lot of that came out of the adult industry, trying to work out quicker ways of getting downloads. When you look at the way you pay online, it was the industry who really pioneered a lot of that work. So the industry was really, in many ways, commercialised.
Because they needed to make sure that you could use your credit card. The details weren't going to be ripped off.
That's right.
And you remained anonymous.
That's right. That's right. So we saw some of, real payment gateways and all of those things, and definitely the way of compressing files, all of that, the adult industry was at the front of. The gunslingers may have designed, the internet, the World Wide Web, but it was the pornographers that made it popular. Definitely, actually. But yes, so we had over the years different ideas of how we could do this. John Howard was probably the most sensible on this, where he said, how about we give parents a filter software and they can pop it on their computer and then they can just control what goes on their computer and what their children see and don't see. That actually was quite sensible, and people like Clive Hamilton going, no, that'll never work. The parents will never do that. And so, well, we could try, and in fact, they did. There was a CD that went round free of charge to people so that they could put a filter on their home computers to protect their children from seeing unwanted adult material.
But Howard wasn't on his own, because there was a communications minister, Stephen Conroy, right-wing Labor Catholic fellow from Victoria. He was right on board, wasn't it?
Oh, no, he went better. He just wanted to go bigger. So he was like, no, John Howard's a fuckwit. That can't work. That won't work. No, we need to put a whole shark net around Australia. We need to filter at the whole of the internet. I mean, and by this stage, this was really an obviously dumb idea. Everyone knew that this was really dumb and that it wouldn't stop anything, but that's what he was going to the election for, that they were going to do this, and this was in the 2000s. So.
Yeah, we're seeing it again now with this ban on social media. This attempt to shut it down rather than regulate it, minimise the harm, find out what the harmful parts of it are and the harmful use is, rather than just sort of just say no.
That's right.
To freedom of thought and freedom of expression.
When I was when we were looking at this, and when it was this idea of building this sort of shark net, that somehow that we could build a net around Australia and protect Australians from accessing adult material. I mean, it was so ridiculous. And then it was like, oh no, violent adult material, that's okay. It's only the non-violent adult material that we don't want on the internet. I mean, it was so stupid, so crazy. It unnecessarily blocked lots of different sites. It definitely didn't block a lot of most of the porn sites. And when, but at the time I was in the UK at a conference, and I had this German academic got up and talked about porn habits of teenage boys and young men in the United Kingdom and Germany. Remarkably, the porn viewing in Germany was incredibly low compared to the UK. And when he looked at this, that the data showed him that it was sex education that actually reduced porn use. So once they actually were learning about sex, once they could figure out the mystery of it, they were actually pretty keen on watching BMX bikes on the internet. They weren't actually wanting to go to hustler.com because they'd got the information. It had been demystified for them. They understood it. And
how many times can you watch it?
Exactly. And then it just other things became just as, became far more interesting to them. So, really, we can't stop people from accessing this. We just have to educate people about it. And as you say, look at the harms of it and provide a harm reduction approach.
And so you spend the best part of 20 years with Eros, and then you start getting very political. You form the Sex Party.
Yeah.
And what a great, my favourite political parties of all time. There's the 40% extra greedy party, which was formed in Tasmania, which I love them. There was the party.
Oh, yeah, the Canberra party.
Yep. And then the Sex Party.
Yep.
And what a party. So you've why get political? Why did you form the Sex Party? Why did you think you needed to take this into the part. Was it the Senate you ran for first?
Well, weirdly, we actually ran in Bradfield.
Oh, the Bradfield by-election.
Bradfield by-election.
Zara Stardust. Oh, my God, I'll never forget that. The Bradfield by-election.
I know, the Higgins by-election was at the same time in Victoria.
Yes.
So I was running in Higgins and she was running in Bradfield.
First political candidate who had featured in a lesbian porn film.
Yes.
And, very
pole danced at the polling booth.
Pole dance, and the sex party had a cunning plan, and that was to get these incredibly hot Italian backpackers in lingerie out at all the Bradfield polling booths. I tell you what, I think you polled really well, didn't you?
We did poll really well, and that was despite.
I voted for you. I was handing it for the Greens, and I went, I'm going to the sex party.
But do you remember Fred Niles' party, Christian Democrats? They ran 12 candidates,
yes,
all for the same party. So they put their 12 disciples into Bradfield as a response to Zara. And I think, Paul Fletcher was running for the Liberals. Anyway, you're now not allowed to do that. They did change the electoral rules to do that. It was, so we had Zara up in Bradfield. I was down in Higgins, which is like Toorak. It's the eastern, posh eastern...
Leafy suburbs, very middle class. You know, I don't know what
bright
they drive
yellow
now,
T-shirts with sex emblazoned across the front. Is a little bit of a surprise to them at 7 a.m. at their train stations, and
But in the sanctity of the polling booth, they snuck in put a one in the sex party box.
And again, this was there was a push by Labor again to ban adult computer games. In fact, they did. So they outlawed adult computer games. You could only have an MA rating here, which meant you could still have a fair bit of violence, but
yeah, you can like Grand Theft Auto.
Yeah,
you can bash someone to death with a pool cue.
Yep.
But you can't feel their boobs.
No, exactly. So there was
in the computer game.
In the computer game. I haven't played it yet, but I'm sure I will one day. Anyway, so there was the computer games. There was the internet censorship where we had Stephen Conroy saying we can just filter the whole of the internet, no problem. It was just the only other country that might have been close to doing that at the time was North Korea, and that was the only comparison you could make to his policy. So we had that. There was also marriage equality, drug law reform, and assisted dying. So these were all issues that were really around people's personal choices and the right to choose. We didn't anticipate winning. In fact, that was never our plan. It was another one where this was a great way to platform these issues, take them to the polling booth as a lobbying exercise to show politicians that people did care about these issues and that they would vote on these issues.
Responsible adults should be able to should be free to make decisions if it's not harming anyone else. It's a principle that's still, very much attractive to a lot of people around the world. And so the sex party gets registered. You start running in elections. Miss out in the Senate. But run in the Senate, get done over by David Leyonhjelm, the famous rat fuckery that Craig Ellis talks about. But in the end, you end up running in Victoria. You pack up the van, move to Victoria, run for northern suburbs. There was a carve up of upper house electorates. Run in 2014. And you win.
I know.
You win. And it scared the living shit out of everyone, didn't it?
They could not believe it. They just could not believe it. And, it did. But
I mean, because you're not only the first former sex worker to make it into Parliament, you're the first woman. I think this is far more important. First woman to start your own political party and get elected.
I know, that's right.
Like, no, people forget that. Like, she's a sex worker. Oh,
yeah,
my God.
yeah.
No. Like, that is the incredible, monumental effort of you, Fiona. A woman, form your own party, get elected, and then they were all howling the house down, weren't
Yeah.
they? Well, what are we going to do? It's the end of civilization.
They were certainly worried about how they were going to address me. Were they going to have to say the word sex in the Parliament? That really worried them. They were,
Really?
at one stage
They just bleep it out. What do they do?
I know that. Well, the clerks and the sort of, the institution of the Parliament itself was just like, how the fuck are we going to do this? As it turned out, it was fine and it rolled off their tongue very quick, very easily, and it didn't bother them. It still would offend people at polling booths. I used to have people say, I can't vote because you're here.
Really?
Or I can't
God.
bring my children because you're here. We used to get a lot of that shit. But the thing was, though, because I'd been a lobbyist for 20 years, I've been campaigning for 20 years, I knew nearly everyone in that parliament because they had either been a politician when I was campaigning or lobbying as Eros, or they'd been a staffer.
Or they'd been on your mailing list.
Or they'd been on the mailing list.
Or they'd been buying up armfuls of dildos at Sexpo. Those pollies, they're all perverts. I know.
Trying to get them to Sexpo, that used to be the funniest thing. We would invite we would send free tickets to every member of parliament in whatever state we were in. And there was one time in South Australia where one of the members of parliament said, yes, I'll come to the event, but will you meet me? He came in a raincoat. He wore a raincoat to Sexpo.
Not like a flasher raincoat.
Like a Mac. He freaked everyone out. He was wearing a hat really low down on his head so he wouldn't be recognised.
I thought you were going to say he came in a gimp mask with chaps.
No, but he did look longingly at some of the displays.
He
That's
paused.
right.
The rubber. The rubber.
So he was, and I was saying, look, if anyone's here, if anyone recognises you here, they're here. So you should be fine.
Yep.
In fact, one other member of South Australia.
There's my pastor. There's my
That's
accountant.
right. You'll probably see a lot of your constituency
Fred
here. Yeah, we used to invite them all the time. We did get the Shadow Attorney General. She came once and she was great. She felt, completely at home, walked around, spoke to everyone like she was at the fruit market and,
The fruit market.
and had a few cocktails with us.
I've got a banana and some
That's
avocados
right.
over here. So you're into Parliament and you hit the ground running because you've been a lobbyist. You know how to get things done. You're ferocious. You're fearless, feisty, and you know how committees work and politicians work. And was that the first year was that when Andrews came in?
Yeah.
Was that when Andrews came in? So a new Labor government as well, a sort of centre-left government as well. There's opportunity because you're in the balance of power. You're in the balance of power. You've got a casting vote on things and you work across the aisle. You're a negotiator. You're a deal maker. What were you doing deals on? Because if not mistaken, you've in that time that you were there with the sex party and
Yes.
then ultimately Reason, you get voluntary assisted dying inquiries, major inquiries, voluntary assisted dying, a massive inquiry into drug law reform, the first calls into Parliament for a royal commission into institutional child sexual abuse, recognising the gig economy, like something that was just not on the radar at all. Like, hey, there's a thing, it's called Uber. Talk about early adopter. Uber, if you know, this is when politicians didn't know what menu log and Uber was and all the rest. Exclusion zones around abortion clinics. Just talk us through some of those achievements. Let's start with the massive one, I think, for me, which was the voluntary assisted dying. I mean, that is just such a pivotal. There was so much opposition to that, and that is going to change everyone's life in Australia, like how they live and then how they die.
And how they die. It was when they've pressed the final button and the results come down, and you're in this sort of tally room, and the media's all there, and I'd been elected, and so the media sort of huddles around you and says, "What you know, what's the first thing? And they're like, it's the sex party. What are they going to do? And I said, look, the first thing I want is voluntary assist. I want an inquiry into end-of-life choices and voluntary assisted dying. And they were all a little bit disappointed, I think, that it was that. And in fact, I was at the opening of Parliament and I was standing there just sort of looking at the smoking ceremony, and I hear this voice behind me going, I'm very disappointed in you. And I turned around and it was Jeff Kennett. And he said, don't get me wrong, I support assisted dying. However, I just thought you'd be a bit more fun. Like, I didn't think you'd do death, like, first. But he did say, he said, make sure you enjoy yourself while you're here. And I think you know that feeling as well. It can be a lot of fun. Anyway.
But why was it? Is it because of your experience with the gay community and HIV? What was it that made you want to do that as a first cab off the rank?
There was that, but I also, you know, there was that that I had seen a lot of my friends get assisted dying illegally.
Yep.
There was, but one of the main reasons was this fantastic man called Peter Short, who called himself the TikTok man before TikTok, because he didn't know whether he had weeks to live or had months to live. And he was so persistent, and he made me promise that if I was elected, it would be the first thing that I did. And I said to Peter, I promise that will be the first thing I did, and it was. And sadly, he died before he could see, before the results of the election came out, or just after that. But at the time, they said to Daniel Andrews, hey, you're going to have to rely on Fiona for your vote. Are you going to support this? And he said, absolutely not. I will not be supporting assisted dying in any shape or form. And then the Greens, like the Greens can do, because I had said this, while you can't speak in Parliament before you've done your inaugural speech, they put up a motion to do an inquiry into assisted dying. And it had never been on their plans. It had never been in their campaigns. But all of a sudden,
they're cutting your lunch.
They're cutting the lunch. However, it was a very unsuccessful motion. Nobody supported it except for me. And so I put up a new motion that called for an inquiry, and Gavin Jennings from the Labor Party said, no, we will agree to this one. And he supported it, and that meant that, I had sent it to a different committee. He had actually put it back onto the committee that I was on. So
because you were the chair of the Social Issues Committee.
I was in the second time. I was at that stage. I was just a member, and it was chaired by a Liberal member who, as luck, and it was luck, had it, was supportive of assisted dying. So we, you know, a lot of the committee wasn't. The majority of the committee was opposed to assisted dying when we started, and the majority of them were in favour of it when we finished.
That's amazing, because you've changed hearts and minds. You've used the Parliament, the processes, that inquiry process, to hear from witnesses, to hear from the advocates, and that changed hearts and minds, and then led to recommendations that the government couldn't ignore. Right. And you used your vote, in a strategic way on a whole range of things to say, hey, yeah, sure, look, you want to do some things. There's some things I need to get done as well.
Like, I don't, and I think, Jeremy, I've seen you doing the same thing. It's, I didn't necessarily want to horse trade with them. However, I would, and I would respect that they had mandates for certain legislation, and I would be respectful of that. And except when times when I just couldn't support it because it was draconian, terrible, shitty laws. But in that, it meant that I had was a much more open relationship with the government, so we could talk, and I could talk to the opposition in similar ways, and that kind of open conversation leads to outcomes where they can be supportive of something that you're doing because you haven't tried to act like a dickhead with
everything.
with everything, exactly, with everything. So even with safe access zones around abortion clinics, that when I put that legislation up, the government said, we're not going to support it, but we will do our own legislation. I said, well, I want you to say that outside, and I want you to say that to the media. Otherwise, I will take it for a vote, and you will have to vote against creating creating protections for women who were being abused as they were going into abortion clinics at a really difficult time in their life. And the minister, to her credit, agreed. She came out, spoke to the media and says, I commit to doing this and I will have it done by this date. And she didn't quite hit the date, but we got it.
You got it.
Yeah. And now every state has it.
Yes, that's right.
And the same with assisted dying.
You led the way.
Yeah.
You really did lead the way, and we've had the reforms. When I was in Parliament last time, they got defeated, but we've now had them enacted in New South Wales. And again in Australia, we've seen Victoria lead the way, and other states come along as well. Well, the other thing you did that was amazing was you raised the issue of the gig economy. You were like people weren't paying attention. There's you, finger on the pulse, actually connected to your community, saying, "Hey, there's a new thing out there, and we've got people that are using this service, but there's a potential there for exploitation. How do we look after these people?"
Yeah, and there was this notion again that they were going to try and prohibit it, but there was already hundreds of thousands of people using Uber. It was already an international phenomenon. So what I wanted to do was create a level playing field, because a lot of the taxis were saying, they were being disadvantaged under what was the current scheme. So my plan was to create a level playing field so that the legislation would capture everyone who was doing ride sharing, whether that was taxis or whether that was Uber. And it was a really interesting piece of legislation, because you're trying to legislate on a platform, not necessarily, and make that platform responsible for the actions of people who use that platform. So it was interesting legislation. When we got it up in the chamber, the opposition agreed to vote for it, which was fantastic. The government assumed that the Greens were supportive, because they had said certain things. And so we started the debate. And it was only halfway through the debate that the Greens were like, oh, no, we're not supporting. No, she's not doing enough for people with disabilities in this legislation. We're not going to support the legislation. Fortunately, the Transport Minister did not know that. So when I got the call about adjourning it off, because they thought I was going to get the numbers and I would have got the vote up. When I got the call to adjourn it off, I said, well, will you come outside and say that to the media and say that you will legislate? And she said, yes, we'll do that. And it was only after she'd done that she realised that I didn't have the numbers and I wouldn't have got the vote through. And we would have lost. But anyway, it was good. And they did, in the end, regulate Uber. And, it's not perfect, and there's a lot more work we need to do on gig economy reform. But it was the beginning of recognising that economy. And
another example, how one coherent, intelligent voice working away on an issue can really make a change. The other area that you're now working in, and it's absolutely fantastic to have you as the Legalise Cannabis Legalise Cannabis Party lead Senate candidate in Victoria. Another area that you didn't shy away from was drug law reform.
Yeah.
You fought for the medically supervised injecting centre in Melbourne successfully, and you raised the issue of cannabis. Talk to us a little bit about those two issues.
Yes, so the supervised injecting room, that was one of the hardest pieces of legislation to get through, because I was never going to get the opposition. So I had to win the government over. And while there were a number of them in the government who were supportive, including the health minister, there was no way that the Premier was supporting a supervised injecting room, even though we had 22 deaths in a 300 square metre area. a 400 square metre area of North Richmond in the inner city of Melbourne. And the coroner, there was a case of a 32-year-old woman, 2 young children, overdoses and dies in the toilet of a takeaway store in North Richmond.
Jesus Christ.
And it was the 4th time that the coroner said, we need a supervised injecting room. So we developed the legislation. The government was like, no way, unless, and I said, well, what would get you over the line? Because you know that it makes sense. You know the coroner has recommended it. You know it's good policy. They say, well, what about the Herald Sun? So you've got to if you can get the Murdoch press on side, we'll maybe think about it. Just by chance, when we had the heroin droughts and we had the huge heroin deaths in the 90s, the editor of the Herald Sun used to do the reports of the number of heroin deaths versus the number of road deaths. So they used to put that on the letters to the editor page each week or each month. He was now the editor, so he'd also had a personal experience with someone overdosing. So he was like, actually, we will support this.
Wow.
And then so I went back to them and said, I've got that. They said, we're still going to say terrible things about the government. We still think Dan Andrews is a dickhead, but we will support this. And then they said, yeah, but what about the police? So I spoke to the Police Association, and the head of the Police Association, Rod Edels, was retiring that day. And he said, Fiona, I'm completely supportive of this, but I'm not going to come out and say it on my last day in the office. You'll need to convince my Wayne Gatt, the new guy. He said, but I will say it tomorrow. And to his credit, he went on 3AW and said that he supported a supervised injecting room. And that gave Wayne the confidence to also support it.
Amazing.
I know. So, look, it was a long story and it took a long... It was
a lot of hard work and a lot of relationship building.
Yeah.
And a key part of that is that people trust you, that they can have a conversation with you that's off the record, that's iterative. We're building understanding. I'm not going to take one thing you say and rush to the media.
Yeah.
I'm about a relationship, trust. That's characterised you, hasn't it? It's a key part of.
Isn't it a strange thing, Jeremy, that trust is actually so important in the work that you do in Parliament, that it is so crucial, and no one would think that about Parliament, that trust really is one of the underlying principles for getting anything done.
And then. Lastly, let's just talk about the other part of drug law reform, which is cannabis. Because you did chair a major inquiry into drug law reform. It came up with a range of really groundbreaking recommendations, I would say long overdue. But one of them is the legalisation of cannabis. Yeah. And now you're with the party, you're running for the Senate. Why do you think we need to legalise cannabis?
Look, again, it's a freedom of choice matter, but there is no reason to criminalise it. So, in that notion of civil liberties, why would you criminalise something if you didn't have to? Why would you criminalise behaviour that you don't need to criminalise, that is not hurting others? And in fact, you are creating harm through the criminalisation. Now, as you mentioned, I was the chair of the Legal and Social Issues Committee, and we did a huge body of work into the criminal justice system. And you just saw that trajectory. Someone gets caught for a small amount of cannabis, and if they are from a disadvantaged background, they are far more likely to be criminalised, and then that will set them on a path to be further criminalised because they're then discriminated, they can't get work, they can't, so they then see the whole social structures fall apart, which then puts them back into the criminal justice system and the revolving door occurs. It's
like, to mix metaphor, it's a revolving door, but it's also a conveyor belt, really, isn't it? Yeah. It's like, I think it's in New South Wales, the stats are, it's the number one reason that young Aboriginal women end up with a conviction in the criminal justice system is cannabis, like a minor cannabis conviction. And then people who get a cannabis conviction, they're then targeted by police for searching. They tell the police to get fucked, or I don't want to be searched, you're going after me. And then all of a sudden they've got an indecent language, assault police, resisting arrest, a much more serious.
That's right.
And it all comes about because of this unnecessary criminality.
That's right.
And that's what you guys found.
Yeah. And when we did the drug law reform inquiry, we travelled, and it was, I know people sort of laugh at politicians' junkets, but it was really eye-opening and it was really informative. And what was really important about that trip was, we went to Portugal, we saw decriminalisation of all drugs. We went to Switzerland, where they give heroin users heroin. We went to England, saw pill testing, went to Colorado and Canada and saw emerging legal models. And the Assistant Commissioner of Police came with us. So he and I sat in the back of the bus arguing for most of the trip, but he saw firsthand what other approaches to drugs how that works, and that it does work. And we spoke to police everywhere we went,
You dealt with the evidence.
That's right.
It wasn't an emotional issue. It wasn't. It was okay. How do we reduce harm? How do we look at this rationally? And you took people to the evidence and put the evidence in front of them, and it works.
And we're now, and so right now it feels a bit like unfinished business. Yeah, I've been a cannabis user all my adult life. I think it's a substance that I use, for health, but also because I enjoy it. But so it's personal. I want to see it legal, and sure, I can now get a prescription and access it. And I certainly, when I wasn't well, I did do that, and it was just the medication for me. But it makes no sense that we are criminalising the use and possession and cultivation of cannabis,
and it creates
in Australia.
A class system too, where if you're disadvantaged, you're poor, you're not au fait with the health system, you can't access legal cannabis. Yeah,
That's right.
If you're middle class, you can.
That's
it
right.
just makes no sense, does it?
And we've seen it in the work that you've been doing in New South Wales. Tens of thousands of people are arrested every year for using cannabis.
70,000.
Yeah. Like that's not selling it. It's not standing at a school gate trying to shove joints down 7-year-olds. It's just using it and possessing it yourself for your own personal pleasure. And we arrest 70,000 people. And that shocks people when you're out at market days and stalls and stuff, and they go, oh, no one gets arrested. Well, they don't if they're white. They don't if they've come, if they've got good family, they don't. But if you are brown or if you live in a disadvantaged suburb, then you do get arrested.
Or regionally, yeah.
Regionally, and it changes. It can change your life. And certainly we've seen that. We've seen the trajectory, and you've also got people mixing with a criminal element, because the only place to source cannabis is from people involved in criminal activity. And quite often that's not the only criminal activity they're involved in.
Exactly. People say that cannabis is a gateway drug. It's not a gateway drug because you take cannabis and you say, oh, now I need to try all other drugs.
Yeah.
It's because the guy that sells the cannabis also might sell meth.
Yeah.
Or might sell acid, or might sell something else, or might, be involved in some other activity. They've decided to make a business out of criminality. I mean, most pot dealers are just dealing pot. That's
exactly.
in my experience.
That's right.
Most of them are, single mums and people just growing a few plants and selling and giving it to their mates. But there is that element there. And so if you want to break that nexus, that's the way to deal with it.
The police, in that drug law reform inquiry, the police told us that on any one day there is over 1,000 hot houses in Victoria. Now, these are run by organised crime.
Yeah.
This is not your next door neighbour growing a few plants.
This is big indoor
and so
grows.
this is these
where
are
they would have probably armed people to protect it.
That's right.
Insurance.
That's right. Yeah, and poor international students are the housekeepers of these places, and they're the ones that get busted. But the police said, we can't bust them. I mean, they had at that time, because they'd done a few big busts, they had so much hydroponic equipment that they had to like start renting warehouses just to store it. They had no way.
They should have auctioned it off.
Seriously, I know.
Keep the cycle going
That's
around.
right.
The feedback loop. Hold on.
Hold on. But yeah, and then disposing of large amounts of organic material also were proving a challenge because they didn't want to burn it. And
I love those videos you see those videos of like reporters. There's one of a guy in the States, and they've got a pile. It must be like 30 tons of weed, and they spark it up. And he just, like, in the end, he's just like a dribbling mess. He's just going, oh.
And what did they think was going to happen?
I
know. So the Victorian police wouldn't burn it, but they couldn't really compost it either. And so they just
sat there.
Just sat there, and they,
a few police going, oh, hold on.
That's right. So
I just helped myself. I thought it was hilarious in Thailand when they legalised cannabis. So it went from, we'll hang you if you've got, a shopping bag of this stuff, to fully legalising it. And they said, oh, and if we've ever confiscated any of your weed, you can come and get it.
Because we've still got it.
We've still got it. So these people are turning up and going, oh, yeah, you took I did 3 years in jail and you took £5 off me. Can I have it back? And they're like, oh, yeah, here it is here.
But,
ridiculous.
I mean, I've been going to Thailand for a very long time, since I was a teenager, and cannabis was always really easy to get over there. And it used to be the grandmas who used to grow it, and it was medicinal for them.
Yeah.
They used it in their teas. They used it they consumed it in a whole range of different ways, but it was always available there. And apparently, because they're recriminalising it, I think, we're trying to put that.
Well, they were. I think
they've stopped. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of resistance from the property sector because there's so many retail outlets that are paying rent, that if they criminalise it again, like there's tens of thousands of retail outlets that, shut up shop, no rent. So the property developers like, hold on. So there's a bit of a pushback there.
And I know I was speaking to someone who spends a lot of time up in the smaller villages there, and he said the police had gone around to all of the older ladies and said, don't worry, it'll be fine when no one's getting busted for growing weed.
I'm glad. I bought a shopping bag of weed in Koh Phangan in the 90s for like $6.
Yep.
This red weed that was all sticks and seeds, and I thought, oh, what's this? This will be. And I like smoked 2 joints and was like, woo! What did the guy call it? He called it, this is rocket to moon. I was like, woo, up near the moon.
Yeah,
you want rocket to moon? And I was like, oh yeah, I'll get one of those.
We used to get it. Like we were staying in Koh Samet and just on the beach bungalows, and the guy who rented the beach bungalows just had like a Hessian sack of it in his room, and in the mornings when you put your breakfast order in, he'd just wrap a bit in some newspaper and give it to you for 5 or 10 baht or something like that. And yeah, it was lovely.
Well, it seems to be working in Thailand. They're ironing out the bugs. Let's say that. Yep. And in terms of cannabis legalisation, you're back, unfinished business. But in terms of a candidate for a political party, I mean, you're like just an absolute the exemplar of what a intelligent, feisty woman can do in Australian politics, change the country, and that's what you have done, Fiona Patten. And so I really hope that, and I'm working hard to
I know
make
you
sure that you get re-elected to the
Yeah.
Senate in Victoria, because there's some unfinished business there.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. And I think there is, and I think Australia's at that point as well. I think we are at the point where cannabis legalisation is not an if, but a when. 80% of Australians support don't believe it should be a crime. So I think we're well on the way. I've just recently been in New York where I've seen, really interesting models for legalisation. Canada will be nearly in its 10th year since it sort of started the process in 2016. So we've got lots of great data to use here. And I think there's a real appetite for change, whether it's financial, but more importantly, I think it's the social justice issues.
Well, you've been an agent of change. You've been an agent of reason, of rationality, and of progressive reform for a very long time, and you've got things done. So more strength to your arm, Fiona Patten. It's been an absolute privilege to have you on the program. It's a privilege to stand with you in this fight. So thanks very much for coming into the weeds.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it, Jeremy.